Under the cold grey dawn of 1660, London's bells screamed in triumph as monarchy and sin returned together. For 11 years, Puritan rule had strangled pleasure, art, and desire beneath sermons of fear and the iron of Cromwell's morality. Now, taverns overflowed, brothels reopened, and laughter echoed through streets once silenced by sanctimony, England's soul demanding release. At the centre of this rebirth stood one man, Charles II, the exiled prince turned merry monarch, whose smile concealed devouring hunger. His return was celebrated as divine providence, but what he truly restored was not faith. It was indulgence itself. Courtiers whispered that his appetites were endless: wine, wit, women, and the power that came from possessing them all. He had learned in exile that the heart of politics was not in Parliament, but in the bedroom. His mistresses were not mere lovers, they were extensions of his rule, courtiers in silk sheets and perfumed diplomacy. Every night became an act of governance, every touch a transaction, every pleasure a form of control. Behind candlelit draperies, oaths were broken, alliances made, and kingdoms traded for a moment of royal favour. The court transformed into a theatre of lust. Jewelled women competing for glances, each a player in his carnal parliament. Barbara Villiers, the bold and ruthless beauty, ruled his chambers like a queen without crown or conscience. Through her, titles were granted, lands exchanged, and enemies exiled, all with a kiss that reeked of power. She embodied the spirit of Restoration England, brazen, hungry, unrepentant, her beauty both weapon and curse. The moralists outside the palace trembled, muttering that the devil had reclaimed his throne through satin and perfume. But inside Whitehall, the air was electric, courtiers drunk on seduction, priests bribed into silence, and the king laughing in God's face. To him, pleasure was not sin. It was proof of life after repression, a sacred rebellion against Puritan ghosts. In Charles's world, morality bent like candle wax, melting under the heat of his charm and the fire of his desires. He believed a kingdom could be ruled with wit and lust more effectively than by sword or scripture. His nights were symphonies of sighs and betrayal, his days, performances of grace masking exhaustion and guilt. England watched with fascination, half disgusted, half enchanted, as its monarch turned corruption into spectacle. Yet beneath the laughter and perfume, the seeds of scandal were already sown, seeds that would poison his dynasty. Because in the royal bed, secrets do not stay buried. They breed heirs, rumours, and ruin, and as the flames of pleasure rose higher, so too did the shadows that would one day consume him. For Charles II was not just the King of England, he was the empire's most dangerous lover, and this story, his story, begins not with a coronation, but with a kiss that damned a kingdom. The scandal that would forever brand the Restoration Court began not with politics, but with a birth. In 1662, Barbara Villiers bore a son she claimed was the king's. Though half of Whitehall whispered otherwise, Charles accepted the child without question, naming him Fitzroy, son of the king, and in doing so, fed the wildfire of rumour. Soon, other women began to appear with children of royal resemblance, each claiming intimacy with the merry monarch. It was said that Charles could not resist a woman's tears or her laughter, and his generosity was his undoing. Illegitimate heirs multiplied like gossip itself, their mothers rewarded with jewels, estates, or influence, depending on the king's mood. Barbara used her position ruthlessly, turning her lovers and her children into instruments of manipulation. She demanded titles for her sons, pensions for herself, and public recognition as the king's chosen mistress. When Parliament objected to her power, she laughed, for she knew her throne was not granted by law but by lust. Even courtiers began to fear her temper. She slapped nobles in public and mocked the Queen in private. She walked into council chambers uninvited, interrupting ministers to whisper secrets into the king's ear, and Charles, ever indulgent, merely smiled, calling her his tiger, as though domination were affection. This defiance infected the entire court. Morality was mocked, decency discarded, and virtue turned into a punchline. Samuel Pepys, chronicler of the age, wrote of masked balls, where nobles danced half naked in the king's presence. He recorded tales of games where courtiers wagered kisses, and women, intoxicated by proximity to power, offered themselves like tribute. The palace became a theatre of desire, where seduction was performance and shame no longer existed. Even priests turned a blind eye, accepting bribes to sanctify marriages broken by adultery and greed. Whitehall's walls absorbed everything, the laughter, the moans, the plotting, until even stone seemed to sweat with sin. The line between pleasure and politics blurred so completely that no man could tell which ruled the other. When Barbara's power waned, another flame rose. Louise de Querouaille, the king's delicate French mistress, wrapped in silks and diplomacy. Unlike the English mistresses who fought openly, Louise conquered quietly, with submission that was never sincere. She arrived as a lady-in-waiting to the Queen, but her mission came from Louis XIV himself, to charm and control. Charles fell instantly, calling her his dear Phubs, and showering her with jewels worth more than fortresses. Ambassadors soon noticed that English treaties began to favour France, and Parliament grew restless with whispers of betrayal. Satirical pamphlets flooded the streets, portraying the king as a puppet tangled in a French courtesan's hair. Cartoonists drew the royal crown replaced by a garter, mocking England's submission to foreign desire. But Charles ignored the outrage, spending nights in her arms while his kingdom seethed with discontent. He was drawn to her refinement, her calm, so unlike Barbara's fury or Nell Gwyn's laughter. Yet beneath that calm was calculation, and through her hands, French gold flowed into English coffers. In every kiss, diplomacy was exchanged. In every sigh, a secret traded. Louise's presence infuriated the people, who adored Nell for her wit, but despised the foreign mistress for her influence. Nell mocked Louise publicly, calling her Squintabella, while the Frenchwoman sneered back, naming Nell the Orange Girl. The rivalry entertained the city, but for the crown, it was poison. Every mistress now a political symbol. The king's bedchamber had become a battlefield, where women fought for supremacy, and England watched as if it were theatre. Catherine of Braganza, the neglected queen, prayed nightly in solitude, her rosary soaked with silent tears. Her faith forbade divorce, her position forbade rebellion, and her body, barren, sealed her humiliation. Even when she fell ill, Charles brought his mistresses to her bedside, claiming comfort while flaunting cruelty. But in those same years, England burned, literally and morally. The Great Plague struck London, followed by the Great Fire of 666, as if the heavens themselves had grown disgusted. Clergymen preached that divine punishment had returned for the sins of the Merry Monarch's court. Pamphlets declared, "God scourges England for her king's whoredoms," and fear began to seep into the royal mirth. Charles laughed outwardly, but grew restless. Sleep came rarely, and dreams haunted him with the faces of those he had wronged. Barbara's tantrums, Louise's control, Nell's teasing. They all blurred into the same haunting melody of guilt. He sought solace in banquets, in jesters, in masquerades, but even the laughter began to sound hollow. As his hair greyed and his vigour waned, the games continued, but the joy was gone. He watched his bastards grow into noblemen, each a reflection of his own excess. The court he had built on pleasure now stood like a decaying mask, still smiling, but cracking beneath its own lies. Rumours swirled that he sought redemption through a secret Catholic confession, forbidden in Protestant England. Even in death, he defied both faiths, dying in the arms of one mistress while whispering to a priest for salvation. When he finally closed his eyes in 1685, the palace fell silent, as if sin itself paused to mourn him. But the echoes of his lust did not die. They lived on in the bloodlines of dukes, in the whispers of courtiers, in history's dark margins. Charles II had ruled through pleasure, but pleasure had ruled him. His throne, built on seduction, could not outlast the flesh that sustained it. And when England looked back on its merry monarch, it saw not a king of glory, but a man undone by his own desires. His legacy was not the crown, nor the peace he briefly brought, but the truth he revealed, that lust, when crowned, always demands a kingdom's soul. The Restoration had promised freedom, art, and laughter, but beneath its silks and candles lay the bones of conscience. For England had learned too late that power bought by pleasure is pleasure paid in ruin, and the women who once ruled his knights became ghosts of scandal, eternal courtiers in the history of sin. By the final decade of his reign, the once vibrant court of Charles II had begun to rot from within, a paradise turning to decay. The same laughter that once filled Whitehall now sounded forced, echoing through corridors that smelled of wine, wax, and regret. The mistresses, once radiant and powerful, aged under the weight of jealousy, disease, and faded beauty. Barbara Villiers, once the unrivaled temptress of the crown, found herself replaced by younger faces and colder ambitions. Her extravagance and arrogance had made her enemies everywhere. Ministers despised her, and even Charles began to tire of her fury. She sold her jewels, traded secrets for gold, and drifted from lover to lover, but the whispers that once trembled before her name now mocked it, calling her the ruin of kings. Nell Gwyn, the people's mistress, remained the last flicker of humanity in the king's darkening world. She made him laugh when others schemed, feeding him oranges and jokes instead of politics and lies. When he was weary from state and scandal, she was the only one who reminded him that he was mortal. She asked for little, a home for her son, a pension for her future, and Charles, unlike with others, granted her peace. Louise de Querouaille, meanwhile, thrived in her own way, her influence deepening as the king's body weakened. Her beauty remained untouched by time, her ambition sharpened by survival. She alone knew the art of outlasting the storm, yet her name, whispered in taverns and parliament alike, became a curse. The French whore, symbol of England's corruption. The court itself had turned poisonous, alliances shifting daily, spies thriving, morality long buried under layers of perfume and deceit. Once, nobles had sought the king's favour with poetry and charm. Now they bribed his mistresses, buying power through their beds. Letters between rivals dripped with venom, threats of exposure, accusations of witchcraft, and promises of revenge. Every scandal that escaped Whitehall rippled through the streets of London, fueling a nation's growing disgust. Pamphleteers painted Charles as a devil in human form, drowning England's virtue in French wine and sin. Yet beneath the ridicule, there was fascination. People despised him, but they could not look away. He was England's paradox, a king both adored and condemned, who made sin fashionable and hypocrisy universal. He had given his people laughter after years of silence, but also loosened the very moral seams of the realm. Even his own clergy, drunk on his favour, turned confession into performance and repentance into satire. The moral collapse was total, and yet no one dared to name it aloud while the king still breathed, but fate would soon speak for them. In February 1685, Charles awoke complaining of pain in his head, dismissing it with a joke about divine punishment. By nightfall, he had collapsed. The palace plunged into panic as doctors bled him in desperation. Mistresses wept, courtiers fled, priests waited in shadow, and for once, the merry monarch did not smile. As his strength faded, he reached for the hand of Louise de Querouaille and whispered for forgiveness. Not from her, but from heaven. In his final moments, he was no longer king, lover, or god of pleasure, only a man terrified of eternity. He called for his brother James, a devout Catholic, and murmured that he had always intended to die in that faith. It was his last defiance, the ultimate secret confession of a life lived between desire and damnation. When he died, the women who had ruled his heart were left adrift, their beauty and power meaningless without his crown. Barbara died in disgrace, her fortune gone. Louise returned to France, hated but wealthy. Nell died poor but beloved. The Queen, Catherine, lived on quietly, praying for the soul of the man who had broken hers. And England, though it crowned another monarch, never truly forgot the shadow Charles had left behind. His death marked not an end, but a warning that a nation ruled by pleasure cannot escape the decay it invites. The Restoration dream, once gilded in laughter and lust, collapsed into moral exhaustion and spiritual emptiness. And yet, history could not resist him. Even centuries later, he remained the symbol of irresistible charm and ruinous indulgence. The diaries, letters, and portraits that survived whisper the same truth, that behind every joke and caress lay a ghost of guilt. Charles II's reign revealed something England had never dared to admit, that civilization's mask is thin and desire always waits beneath. His mistresses were not mere lovers, but mirrors, each reflecting the faces of power, greed and longing that ruled an empire. In the end, the merry monarch did not simply die, he dissolved, leaving behind the scent of roses and sin. And in every palace since, where candles flicker over silken beds, the echo of his laughter still lingers, seductive, sorrowful, and damned. Even in death, Charles II refused to fade quietly into history. His legacy lived not in marble or scripture, but in whispers, the kind that outlast monuments and burn deeper than sermons. The court he built became legend, a warning cloaked in laughter, that when pleasure rules the throne, ruin waits at the door, yet the England he left behind was haunted by memory, by lust, by the scent of decadence that clung to its silk. His illegitimate sons were scattered across the aristocracy, each carrying fragments of his charm and corruption. They became dukes, generals, patrons of the arts, living testaments to a king who made immortality through sin. The royal bloodline itself was reshaped by desire. Even centuries later, noble families traced their lineage to his scandalous knights. Barbara's descendants would sit in Parliament, Nell's children would mingle with dukes, and Louise's heirs would walk the courts of Europe. The king who turned lust into politics had left his mark on every chamber of power, long after his body rotted in Westminster. But for the people of England, the legacy was darker, a lingering sickness of spirit, a memory of moral collapse. The Puritan ghost returned, wearing new faces, preaching restraint and piety, as if to scrub away the stain of the merry monarch. His reign became a parable in every sermon and a fascination in every tavern tale. The moralists called him the king who sold England for kisses. The romantics, centuries later, called him the last man who truly lived. Both were right. For Charles had not merely reigned, he had performed, turning monarchy into theatre, politics into desire. The Restoration was his stage, and the world his audience, entranced, scandalized, unable to look away. The painters captured him in regal calm, but none could paint the truth, that his charm was built on exhaustion and fear. Behind every smile, there was a man terrified of silence, because silence meant reflection, and reflection meant guilt. He filled his days with noise, with laughter, with women, so that his conscience could never speak. Even his generosity was a disguise. He gave lavishly to appear divine, but what he sought was forgiveness. Every mistress was both comfort and confession, every embrace a way to forget the emptiness of the crown. He had learned too late that the heart of empire is not strength, but loneliness. The crown may command armies, but it cannot command affection without paying in flesh and faith. And so Charles paid, coin by coin, lover by lover, until even his pleasures turned hollow. He believed desire could heal the wounds of civil war, but it only replaced one tyranny with another. England had traded Cromwell's chains for Charles's kisses, and both bound the soul in different ways. But beneath the scandal, beneath the perfumes and betrayals, there was something undeniably human about him. He was not the monster the Puritans claimed, nor the hero his lovers imagined, but a man devoured by his own need to feel alive. That hunger made him charming, made him dangerous, and ultimately made him immortal, because history does not remember saints. It remembers those who dared to live without apology. And Charles, in all his sin and splendor, lived more vividly than any king before or after him. He turned his weaknesses into legend, his indulgence into myth, and his ruin into entertainment for generations. But the cost was everything: faith, loyalty, family, and peace, sacrificed at the altar of desire. His mistresses became symbols of that sacrifice, their names inked forever beside his in the margins of shame. Barbara, Nell, Louise, each a chapter in his confession, each proof that the body can be more powerful than the crown. Their portraits still hang in galleries, faces painted in beauty, eyes heavy with secrets they never confessed. They are not just women of pleasure, they are ghosts of an empire's moral collapse. And through them, the story of Charles II survives, a tale of how power and passion devour each other until nothing remains but memory. Even now, centuries later, his reign seduces historians the way he once seduced courtiers, with the promise of forbidden truth. Because deep down, every age wonders what it would be like to live as he did, unashamed, unrestrained, untouchable. But every age also learns the same lesson he ignored, that pleasure is sweetest when fleeting and fatal when worshipped. Charles II taught England that truth, not with sermons, but with scandal. He showed the world that a kingdom can drown not in war, but in the quiet intoxication of its own desires. And though time has washed away the perfume and laughter, his echo remains, soft but relentless, a warning wrapped in charm. The merry monarch still smiles from his portraits, his eyes glimmering with the secret he carried to the grave. That power is never conquered by force, it is conquered by pleasure, and that every empire, no matter how divine it seems, eventually kneels before its own appetite. Centuries later, when scholars opened the archives of Charles II's reign, they found more than treaties and royal decrees. They found desire written in ink and whispers. Letters between mistresses and ministers revealed how bodies had replaced ballots, how kisses decided the fate of nations. It was not policy that built the Restoration Court, but passion, raw, ungoverned, and carefully disguised as politics. The king's handwriting was scattered with affectionate nicknames and secret codes, showing how the bedroom had become a war room. Barbara Villiers demanded titles in exchange for her silence. Each woman understood the game, and none pretended virtue. The Restoration had turned corruption into culture, and the very idea of sin into sophistication. To be scandalous was to be fashionable. To be pure was to be forgotten. The theatre thrived under this new morality, or immorality, reflecting the court's indulgence back to the people. Playwrights like Dryden and Wycherley dressed royal vices in comedy, masking tragedy with wit, turning lust into applause. Every night, as actors mimicked the monarch's affairs, London laughed, not realizing it was laughing at itself. The court had infected the nation. The disease of hypocrisy became England's favourite art form. Men who denounced Charles in church still courted mistresses in secret, while women envied those who could sin in satin. The Restoration's brilliance blinded everyone. Gold leaf covering rot, perfume hiding decay. Yet beneath that splendour, something profound had changed. The boundaries of power, faith, and morality had been permanently broken. Before Charles, kings ruled by divine right. After him, they ruled by charm, or not at all. He had taught the crown that authority could be seduced, that love and loyalty could be purchased with the same hand. His courtiers learned too, that to survive in such a world, one must become both sinner and actor. And so England entered the age of masks, where no one spoke truth, only performance. Even religion, once sacred, became theatre. Priests blessing sins they could no longer condemn. When the new king, James II, ascended the throne, he inherited not a nation, but a hangover. The people no longer trusted purity, the clergy no longer trusted pleasure, and the monarchy no longer trusted itself. Charles had left his brother a kingdom drenched in beauty and corruption, and no sermon could wash it clean. Historians later tried to paint him as complex, a modern man born too soon, torn between faith and freedom. But those who read the diaries of his lovers knew better. He was not torn, he simply refused to choose. He wanted the world and heaven both, believing charm could bridge the distance between sin and salvation. In a way, that belief made him timeless, the first truly human king, flawed, magnetic, and self-aware. He did not pretend to be righteous. He reveled in his vices and turned them into legend, and that is why his story still matters, because it reveals a truth older than crowns and empires. That power, when mixed with desire, always ends in tragedy disguised as pleasure. The Restoration glittered because it was burning, every candle a countdown to collapse. Its laughter was nervous, its beauty desperate, its joy, the frantic joy of those who sense the end. And when it finally ended, when the perfumes faded and the mistresses vanished, England awoke to silence, cold, sober, ashamed, but the damage was done. Charles II had changed not just his century, but the soul of monarchy itself. From that moment on, rulers would be measured not by divine favour, but by their humanity, their weaknesses, their scandals, their hearts. Even now, when modern royals stumble into affairs and controversies, the press calls them echoes of Charles. He became the ghost that never leaves the palace, a reminder that behind every royal smile lies hunger and history. His lovers became archetypes, the manipulative mistress, the comic concubine, the foreign spy, roles that have never truly vanished. For though the age of kings has faded, the theatre of power remains, still dressed in silk and secrets. The Merry Monarch taught us that history is not written by the virtuous, it is written by the unforgettable, and he was unforgettable. Every scandal, every jest, every sigh that left his court still drifts through time, whispering warnings to those who inherit crowns. Power without restraint becomes hunger. Desire without conscience becomes destiny. And the man who called himself merry learned too late that laughter cannot drown guilt. It only delays its echo. So when his portrait smiles down from museum walls, the viewer feels both fascination and unease. Because behind that grin lies a question that history never answered. Was Charles II a man enslaved by his pleasures, or a king who understood that all power, at its heart, is an act of seduction? Perhaps both, and perhaps that is why, even now, the candlelight in his painted eyes never quite goes out. Time, however, has a cruel way of turning scandal into beauty. The same acts once condemned as depraved became, over centuries, romantic curiosities, painted over with charm, rewritten as wit. Charles II's court, once a living theatre of lust and deception, transformed in memory into a glittering age of elegance and laughter. Historians softened his sins into vices of vitality, forgetting the broken lives left behind in the shadows of his pleasure. The portraits that hang in galleries today lie. Their golden frames cannot hold the stench of what truly happened behind those velvet curtains. Barbara Villiers, immortalized in oil with soft light and pearls, looks serene, not the ruthless manipulator who traded loyalty for luxury. Louise de Querouaille, painted in angelic blue, conceals the espionage she carried beneath her lace, every caress an act of politics. Nell Gwyn, the people's mistress, smiles warmly from her portraits, but her story was one of survival through humiliation and laughter's disguise. And Charles, the so-called Merry Monarch, gazes from his canvas with eyes that still seem to flirt. Centuries after his flesh has turned to dust, that gaze is the essence of his curse. Forever charming, forever dangerous, forever misunderstood. Because beneath the silk, the wit, the laughter, there was rot, a moral gangrene that spread through every corner of his kingdom. England's soul had been tempted by beauty and wit, and when the show ended, it awoke hollow and uncertain. The Restoration ended, but the disease it birthed never truly died. It evolved into the hypocrisy of future courts. His successors wore chastity like armor, but indulged in private the very sins they condemned in public. The people, too, learned to live double lives, moral by day, indulgent by night, the truest legacy of Charles's England. His reign taught a nation how to smile while sinning, how to confess without repenting, how to play virtue as theatre. This duplicity became England's greatest export. The refined hypocrisy that powered its diplomacy, its empire, even its religion. Every act of conquest in later centuries carried the same logic as the king's seductions. Domination disguised as affection. The crown learned to conquer colonies the same way. Charles conquered women with gifts, with charm, with gentle corruption. And though the world changed, the pattern did not. Even in the age of empires and revolutions, the spirit of Charles II lived in every leader who ruled through charisma rather than conviction. He had proven that to control the masses, one need not inspire them, one only needs to entertain them. That was his true genius and his ultimate tragedy. He governed not through fear, but fascination, not by divine right, but by desire, and in doing so, he revealed the most forbidden truth of all, that people love their chains when they are gilded and made to dance. England had not been liberated from Puritan repression. It had merely traded sermons for satire, guilt for glamour. His court became the blueprint for every decadent regime that followed, from Versailles to the palaces of future tyrants. Because decadence, once crowned, never truly dies. It changes names, it changes costumes, but its heart remains the same. Charles II's world was not an era. It was a cycle, one that returns whenever power forgets its soul. And today, when we look upon the glimmering surfaces of celebrity, politics, and royal intrigue, we see the reflection of that same disease, the manipulation through charm, the spectacle replacing truth, the craving for beauty over morality. All are his descendants. The merry monarch did not just corrupt his time, he baptized the modern world in charm and deceit. His laughter still echoes in every scandal we consume, every leader who wins hearts while betraying trust. For what Charles understood, and what the world has never unlearned, is that he did not command through terror, nor through faith. He ruled through desire, through the soft tyranny of affection. It is a rule more dangerous than the sword, because it feels like freedom while it robs the soul. In the Restoration Court, pleasure was not rebellion, it was obedience by another name. The courtiers obeyed because they wanted to, because sin was wrapped in laughter, because corruption had become culture, and so an entire nation learned to bow, not to the throne, but to temptation. This, perhaps, was Charles's most enduring invention. Power that persuades rather than punishes. He did not seek to be feared, he sought to be loved, and love became his weapon. Every jest, every gesture, every indulgence was calculated to soften resistance and silence conscience. He was not the villain of his time, he was its mirror. The people who cheered him, who laughed at his wit and adored his charm, were accomplices in their own decline. They had tired of piety and welcomed decadence as if it were deliverance. Charles simply gave them what they already desired, the illusion that sin could be civilized. And when the illusion faded, they blamed him, as if he had not merely reflected their own hunger for forbidden freedom. That is why his story still haunts every society that mistakes pleasure for progress. It is not about a king's lust, but about a people's surrender. The Restoration, beneath its gold and silk, was not rebirth, it was relapse. A relapse into the oldest human lie. That beauty excuses cruelty, that laughter erases guilt. When Charles smiled, the world forgave him, and in that forgiveness it damned itself. Even his mistresses, who schemed and suffered and triumphed in his bed,